Dr. C. Stephen Evans will be speaking today on C.S. Lewis's moral argument for the existence of God. There could hardly be a more ideal person to address this topic. Dr. Evans is an accomplished scholar and philosopher. He's the university professor of philosophy and the humanities here at Baylor, where he joined the faculty over a decade ago after serving at several other distinguished universities. He's a graduate of Wheaton College and of Yale University. He is the author of 15 books and the editor of, by my count, 9 more, as well as dozens of important philosophical essays. While he is best known for his work, his academic work on the thought of Soren Kierkegaard, Dr. Evans is, like Lewis himself, a scholar who never lost the common touch and has never forsaken the responsibility to address a broad public Christian audience. This, of course, has made him a highly sought-after speaker and an excellent teacher to our undergraduates here at Baylor. Dr. Evans literally wrote the book, on the topic we'll be considering today. And I use literally there, Ralph, in the proper term. He literally wrote the book on the topic we'll be considering today. I do stretch the word in one way because he actually wrote 2 books on the topic we'll be considering today. The first book is Natural Science and Knowledge of God, a new look at theistic arguments. This one. And the second is on God and moral obligation. Both were published with Oxford University Press since 2010. The books are not only, as I brought to show you, covered in a more beautiful way than your average academic press offering. They are also full of interesting reflections and important ideas. They are important for consideration of seasoned scholars, and they are accessible to first-time readers on these topics. And I say this after having myself written a review for the first of these 2 books, which, interestingly enough, won the C.S. Lewis Book Prize, awarded by the University of St. Thomas. So with these brief remarks, I think I have said enough to make it clear that I spoke literally as well whenever I began by saying we could hardly have a better speaker to address the topic today of C.S. Lewis's moral argument for the existence of God. So without further ado, I ask you to help me welcome Dr. Evans to the podium.
Just don't take my paper.
Yeah.
Technology is terrifying to me, so I first have to make sure that that microphone isn't going to bite me or anything like that. Well, it's a great honor for me to be here. Is it not on?
It is. Let me see if I can make it louder.
I'll move it up maybe. How's that? Is that any better or worse? Better? Well, I appreciate very much Dr. Beerus's kind introduction, although I might have to ask the Lord to forgive him for stretching the truth just a little bit, because I'm hardly the ideal person, I think, to speak on Lewis, but also he must forgive me for enjoying it so much. So, C.S. Lewis has had a tremendous impact on my life. I'm sure, very sure, that the first philosophical book I ever read was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I remember it quite clearly. My sister had come home from Wheaton College, and she had a copy of this book, and she left it lying around, and I picked it up and read it. I think I was in the 9th grade at the time. But that probably started me off thinking philosophically and getting me interested in philosophical questions. And I've continued to read Lewis and reread Lewis over the years. I have to confess that my favorite Lewis books are the Narnia books and also The Great Divorce, although the Screwtape Letters is wonderful, especially when heard aloud. John Cleese has a great recording of the Screwtape Letters. If you've never heard it, I recommend it. but I had not read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity in many, many years. And when I first agreed to give this talk, I said, well, sure, I'll talk about the moral argument, but I'm not really going to talk about Lewis. I'll just give my version of the moral argument and loosely say something about Lewis's version at the beginning. But when I reread Mere Christianity, preparing for this talk, I thought I should at least do that. I discovered or realized that actually Lewis's argument is really very close to my argument. So that in talking about the moral argument as I would formulate it myself, I really was talking about Lewis's argument, and I decided to sort of shift gears. And so this talk is really a kind of exegetical talk. I'm really going to try to unpack the argument Lewis gives for the existence of God in the first few chapters of Mere Christianity. You all know, I'm sure, that Mere Christianity grew out of a series of radio talks that Lewis gave for the BBC during World War II. In the book, Lewis employs what I would call a classical two-stage apologetic strategy. The first stage defends the reasonableness of belief in God. The second stage then argues for distinctively Christian beliefs, starting with the divinity of Christ and then giving arguments for other important Christian beliefs. At the heart of the first stage of this two-stage apologetic is a moral argument for God's reality. And the logical core of this argument, I think, can be expressed very, very simply. And so if you look at your handout, version 1, I've given a kind of reconstruction of the argument as I see it. It goes something like this. There is an objective moral law for human beings. 2, if there is an objective moral law for humans, there's a God. 3, therefore there is a God. Now, I'm sure it's obvious to anyone who's even had introduction to logic that this is a logically valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. So the only interesting questions are the ones we might raise about the premises. Are the premises true? How do we know them to be true? Now, of course, that's just one way of formulating the argument. There are lots of other ways. One might, for example, see the argument as what is sometimes called an inference to the best explanation. Here is the second version on your handout. 1, the existence of an objective moral law for humans is a surprising fact that calls for an explanation. 2, the best explanation for the existence of an objective moral law for humans is that a God exists who is the source of that moral law. 3, probably a God exists who is the source of the moral law. Now, I think once more, as long as one likes inferences to the best explanation types of arguments, there's nothing objectionable about the form of this argument. The really interesting questions will also concern the truth of the premises. And I think that part of Lewis's genius lies right here. That is, he knows how to make the premises convincing. He knows how to talk to us, to help us see that in a way we already believe what he's trying to tell us. But that takes imagination. And that was something Lewis had a great deal of, more than I think the average philosopher. It's sometimes, we sometimes forget, we know Lewis as a professor of literature, the author of lots of literary books, but Lewis's undergraduate degree was actually in philosophy. So he was trained as a philosopher and never, I think, lost his zest for doing philosophy. Now, this second argument, as I presented it, could be seen as a way of supporting the second premise of the first argument. That is, if one asks, why is it that if there are objective moral obligations, there must be a God? That is, why should we think the second premise of the first argument is true? And I think one way of answering that question would be to say, well, God provides the best explanation for the existence of the moral obligations. Now, the fact that in the BBC talks, as well as in the book that he later produced as the outcome of those talks, the fact that Lewis is addressing very ordinary people, he's not addressing academics, he's not addressing professors or even students, that may mislead us into thinking that his argument is unsophisticated. Is it? Well, in one sense, it is. That is, as I said, it's addressed very simply to very ordinary people. But I think in another sense, it's not unsophisticated. The kinds of considerations Lewis appeals to in the book can be developed with sophistication and subtlety if one is addressing a different audience than Lewis is addressing in the book. And that's in a way what I tried to do in God and Moral Obligation. But I think that many of the moves Lewis makes in the book are exactly the right moves for a philosopher to make who wants to appeal to a moral argument to justify theistic belief. Now, one interesting thing I think that's going on in the first few chapters of Mere Christianity is that Lewis is really doing two things at once. Explicitly, he is giving us an argument that morality provides evidence for God's existence. But I think implicitly, he's also giving us an argument that ordinary people can believe in God without any arguments, and they may be reasonable in doing so. Some of you may know that there has been a debate in the last few decades among the field of philosophy of religion between a group who are called Reformed epistemologists, who claim that belief in God can be properly basic. It can be something that's reasonable to hold without any arguments. And some other people who are often called evidentialists, who, as the name implies, say that belief in God is the sort of thing that requires evidence if it's going to be reasonable. Now, Lewis wrote a long time before this dispute developed, but I think if he were writing today, he would say that both sides are correct. And here, I'm happy to have him on my side because that's what I tried to argue in my book, Natural Science and Knowledge of God. It's true that belief in God can be reasonable even without arguments. There are natural signs that point to God's reality, and those signs can be perceived and, so to speak, read without any kind of formal argument. But it's also true, I think, that these natural signs do provide evidence and that the evidence can be articulated in the form of powerful arguments. So both sides, in my view, are right. How can people reasonably believe in God without arguments? Or how do I think Lewis is supporting this? I think the key to understanding this is to see that for Lewis, morality exists for us as a law or a set of requirements or obligations. When people become aware of their moral obligations, he thinks what they are really aware of is God's claim on them, God's requirement that they live their lives in a certain way. Of course, not everyone who is aware of moral obligations realizes that these are, in fact, God's word addressed to them. But I think Lewis thinks that that's exactly what moral obligations really are. God cannot, Lewis says in one of the early chapters, he cannot show himself simply as a fact within the universe, just as an architect, he says, cannot be simply a wall or a staircase or a fireplace in a house that the architect has designed. God shows himself rather as, quote, an influence or command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. But someone who is directly aware of God speaking to them through such a command perhaps will not always need an argument for God's existence because such a person has a direct awareness of God. That's what I think, at least. So I think it's clear that Lewis really accepts a divine command view of our moral duties, the kind of view that I defended in my last book that Todd just showed you on God and moral obligation. And obviously, if you think that moral obligations are literally God's commands, it's not too difficult to construct a moral argument for theism. Now, many people, I think, don't realize that Lewis actually does hold a divine command theory of moral obligations. The reason they think this is that they have confused a divine command view of moral obligations with a different claim, namely the claim that morality is subject to God's will in a sort of arbitrary way. In other words, they've confused what I would call a divine command account of moral obligation with what is sometimes called voluntarism. Voluntarism is the claim that ethical truths are grounded in God's will, so that whatever God wills to be right or good would be right or good. On such a voluntarist view, if God commanded us to be cruel murderers who raped and tortured other people, it would be morally right to be cruel murderers who rape and torture other people. Now, Lewis clearly rejects this kind of voluntarism. In fact, he regards it as a monstrous view. However, a divine command view of morality doesn't have to say anything like this. It doesn't have to adopt a voluntarism. It's true that some divine command theorists have also been voluntarists. That is, they have held that God has some discretion about what he commands. So, for example, someone might say, God could have commanded us, instead of commanding us to rest one day out of 7, he could have commanded us to rest 20 hours once a week, or a day and a half once a week. And if God had done this, perhaps it would be right for us to rest 20 hours, or a day and a half. However, very few divine command theorists have thought that God could just command anything, and that anything he commanded would be right. After all, God is essentially good, and so it seems logical to think that his commands must necessarily be directed at the good. Why, for example, does God command human beings to worship God and not idols? It must be because God is supremely good, and it would not be good for humans to worship anything other than what is supremely good. So at least some of God's commands are necessary. They're in no way arbitrary or based on any kind of arbitrary act of will. They are determined by God's understanding of the good. In fact, some divine command theorists have held that all of God's commands are necessary. So therefore, the voluntarist thesis and the divine command thesis are logically distinguishable. You can hold that all of God's commands are necessary and still be a divine command theorist, on my view. Because even if God's commands are necessary, when he commands us to do an action, that action acquires a new moral status by virtue of God's commanding it. If we disobey that command, we are not only doing something that may be bad, and maybe it would have been bad even if God hadn't given us the command, but we are now doing something that breaks our relationship with God, and that perhaps dishonors, it fails to give God the gratitude that we owe him as his creatures, as people to whom he has given every good gift that we have. So I think that Lewis thinks of moral obligations as what I call a natural sign for God's existence. The idea that I developed in my book, Natural Signs and Knowledge of God, which I'm very pleased to say, and I don't think this is in the least ironic, as Todd said, won the C.S. Lewis Prize for Best Book in Philosophy of Religion some time ago. A natural sign is simply some experience or object that God has put into the created order so that it would point us towards him and towards his reality. Just as we can naturally recognize a smile or a frown as an expression of happiness or unhappiness, so natural signs for God naturally tend to produce belief in God. The signs point to God, and we humans have a natural disposition to respond to the sign by recognizing what the sign points to. So in the case of moral obligations, we experience ourselves as accountable or responsible to someone or something. Lewis thinks that this someone or something is in fact God. Someone who has the skill to read the sign correctly then may not need an argument for God's existence any more than someone who sees a smile or a frown on another human being's face needs an argument to know what that other person is thinking. Of course, not everyone who is aware of a moral obligation realizes these duties are a word from God. So not everyone, in fact, knows about God or believes in God. What do such people need? Perhaps they need help in recognizing God's voice. Maybe they need to have their imagination stretched. Maybe they need to be taught the skill of how to interpret the sign, because interpretation is itself a skill. They may have false views about morality that block them from recognizing that God is trying to communicate to them through morality. And here is where arguments may be helpful. The argument takes the natural sign, makes explicit the way the sign points to God. And in the course of doing so, when we defend the premises of the argument, this will usually involve responding to and correcting the false beliefs a person has that prevents that person from recognizing that it is God who is addressing them in morality. These false beliefs will often appear then as objections to the premises of the argument when we, in a sense, construct an argument based on a natural sign. Natural signs can therefore be developed into arguments, and in many cases these arguments are valuable and I think they are powerful. So in what follows, I'm going to look at the ways Lewis develops the moral argument by looking mainly at how he defends the argument against certain objections. Since he is, as I've said, addressing a broad audience, both his formulation of the objections and his responses tend to be very brief. After all, he was giving radio talks. He had a very short amount of time to make his case. But I want to try and show that many of the objections that he considers are similar to the objections that would today be raised by much more sophisticated atheistic philosophers, and also that the kinds of responses Lewis gives to those objections is, I think, in essence, the type of response that a contemporary philosopher should make who wants to defend the moral arguments against these more sophisticated attacks. So there's wisdom, you might say, embodied in the simple words of Lewis. So let's look at the first premise of my first formulation of Lewis's argument, which says there is an objective moral law for humans. The first premise of the argument, as I've reconstructed it, is something that could be it could be denied in a couple of ways. One could simply say there isn't any such thing as morality, and therefore the claim that there is an objective moral law is false. Or one could admit that there is such a thing as morality, but deny that morality is objective, treating morality as something else. So there's different ways of trying to undermine the first principle. Lewis initially, in Mere Christianity, defends this claim by appealing to the fact that when we humans get into arguments, when we disagree with each other and start to criticize each other, we often appeal to some kind of standard that we think people ought to live up to. Here's the examples Lewis gives. We say things like this: how'd you like it if someone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was here first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing anything to you. And so on. Now, Lewis notes that when you listen in on these types of quarrels, the people who are being criticized usually do not deny the validity of the standard appealed to. Instead, they try to claim that they're not really violating the standard, or else that they have some special excuse, which means it isn't wrong in their case to do what they're doing. In other words, Lewis argues, the standards are recognized and accepted by all sides of these arguments. So that's his initial sort of foray into defending the claim that there is such a thing as objective morality. He more or less says, just observe your fellow human beings, and you'll see that all of us, in fact, do accept this view in our lives, even if we don't accept it when we are writing philosophy books or doing theory. Now, as I said, there's two ways of trying to undermine the objection. The first person who might undermine it, I'm going to call the moral skeptic. This is someone who simply denies there is any such thing as morality, or at least denies there's anything like morality that we can know about. Lewis responds to this view with an argument that the moral skeptic is usually not, and perhaps never can be, fully consistent in his skepticism. It's one thing to affirm moral skepticism in the lecture hall, or perhaps when one is engaging in bad behavior and wants to rationalize that behavior. But things look quite different when the moral skeptic is himself the victim of immoral behavior. And here's Lewis. He says, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining it's not fair before you can say Jack Robinson. The very fact that all of us, when we do wrong, feel it's necessary to offer excuses for our behavior shows that we all do really believe in morality. Now, of course, there are contemporary philosophers who are moral skeptics and who offer more sophisticated versions of this sort of attack. There are, for example, followers of Nietzsche who claim that what we call morality is simply a human invention motivated by our will to power. So when I say something is right or something is good, really I'm trying to control you and dominate you, get you to behave as I want you to behave. The Judeo-Christian morality, which emphasizes the importance of justice and the need for compassion, on Nietzsche's view, is motivated by a kind of resentment on the part of the masses who are sort of weak and who have been oppressed by the strong, and they resent the strong, and they strike back by developing the idea that the strong are immoral, they're evil people because they're oppressing me. So that's one way a contemporary person might try to be a moral skeptic. You could be a Nietzschean. There are also those, perhaps not as many as there might have been 50 or 60 years ago, who follow Marx. Marx, his official view is that morality is an invention of the ruling class. It's really another sort of instrument of power. It's designed to prevent the working classes from revolting against their economic masters. It tells them you have to be good, you mustn't use violence or anything like that. And that's a way of protecting the interest of the ruling classes. Now, obviously, in Mere Christianity and in these broadcast talks, Lewis did not have time or space to develop and respond to these sorts of sophisticated views. They were probably not very common in his intended audience, because you have to remember only a small percentage of the population went to university in England in these days. So he did not have a university audience in mind at all. Nevertheless, I think the kind of response Lewis does give to moral skepticism is essentially what should be said to the Nietzschean or the Marxist. I think the best response to the Nietzschean is to point out that the Nietzschean is unlikely to take such a cynical and skeptical view if faced with a real example of injustice and oppression. If we look, for example, at something like apartheid, and the evil of apartheid, it's pretty hard not to see that as really wrong, really evil, really unjust. As for the Marxists, it's hard to see how class oppression could be denounced as wrong unless there really is a standard of justice that transcends what the ruling classes might say. Interestingly, I think Nietzsche could be useful to the defender of morality at this point. For Nietzsche says that for all of Marx's claim to be a scientific socialist, not basing his ideas on philosophy or anything like that, at bottom, Nietzsche says Marxism is a kind of Christian heresy. It's an outgrowth of the Christian ethic, which values compassion for the weak and the poor. And I think Nietzsche was right about that. Now, another form of moral skepticism that's prominent among some contemporary secular philosophers is a kind of moral subjectivism. This is a view that says, oh yes, there surely is such a thing as morality, but it's not objective, it's something subjective. Morality is simply an expression or projection of something like an attitude or an emotion. The philosophers we call expressivists say this. Other philosophers, who are called prescriptivists, add to this story the idea that morality involves a kind of demand that a person making a moral claim is making on others. So, on this view, if I say stealing is wrong, what I'm really doing is something like this. I'm expressing my disapproval of stealing. I'm saying I don't approve it. And I'm also saying, I would like you to think about this the way I do. I want you to share my attitudes. Now, of course, Lewis doesn't consider such sophisticated versions of moral subjectivism, but he does consider the idea that morality is simply the expression of a personal attitude, and he argues this cannot be the case. He claims that a person who says that someone has violated the moral law is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. Rather, the claim is that the person has violated a standard that is in some way authoritative and objective. If I steal from you and you tell me that you disapprove of what I've done, I might well respond that I don't care whether you approve of me or not. I don't value your opinion very much. Of course, I might care about what other people think about me, even if I don't care about what you think. But in general, subjective attitudes don't carry moral authority. Typically, however, when someone is accused of a moral fault, they don't dismiss the moral standard as simply some sort of subjective projection. Rather, they argue there's some special excuse that justifies their behavior. The sting that lies in the charge and the assumption behind the reply shows, Lewis thinks, that the issue doesn't merely concern a subjective attitude. So even though he's not considering sophisticated moral theories that we would today look at if we were teaching a course in metaethics or foundations of morality, theories like emotivism or expressivism or prescriptivism, nevertheless, I think Lewis does highlight what is wrong with all forms of moral subjectivism. They all fail to account for the authority we recognize morality as having. So there are certainly lots of moral skeptics, but perhaps another way, a more plausible way of denying the objectivity of morality is to say, well, sure, morality transcends the individual. It's not just an expression of my individual emotions and attitudes, but it has some sort of social grounding. In other words, some people think morality is something cultural, and one way of denying the objectivity of morality is to adopt a view that we call cultural relativism. And Lewis explicitly does consider cultural relativism. He says, I know that some people say the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all people is unsound because different civilizations in different ages have had quite different moralities. Lewis replies to this view in several ways. In part, he argues that the differences in moral beliefs between different cultures are not absolute. There are differences, but there are also deep similarities. Quote, if anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, say, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike him will be how very like they are to each other and to our own sense of right and wrong. Lewis adds to this argument by claiming that much of what appears to be moral disagreements are actually not moral disagreements at all. They're actually disagreements about non-moral facts. For example, he discusses the idea that it's true that a few hundred years before him, people in England thought it was morally permissible to put witches to death. But yet no one in his time, in World War II in England, would agree with that sort of view. But Lewis says that this apparent moral difference actually stems from a difference in non-moral beliefs. We don't think it's okay to punish witches because we don't believe there are any true witches. If we, like the people several hundred years ago, believed that there actually were people who had sold their souls to the devil in exchange for supernatural powers, which they then used to, quote, kill their neighbors, drive them mad, or bring bad weather, it's not clear that we wouldn't agree that such people deserve very harsh punishment indeed. Now, that there are moral differences is clear, and Lewis admits that. Some people think it's okay, he says, for a man to have 4 wives. Others think that a man should have only 1 wife. However, Lewis claims that in no culture do people think that people can simply have sex with anyone at any old time. People have had different ideas about how unselfish we are required to be by morality, but no one has ever thought that selfishness was a virtue. Lewis also argues that cultural relativism must be false because none of us really believe it. None of us believe truly that all moral systems are equally valid. Even if there are differences, we don't think that the differences mean that they're all correct. Some of them just may be wrong. His listeners and readers during and after World War II would certainly have thought that Nazi ideas of morality were defective and inferior to the views held by, say, democratic liberals. But anyone who thinks that some moral systems are better than others is committed to the claim that there is a standard by which these systems can be measured. And Lewis points out another argument in this favor. Many of us think that there are some individuals who are morally ahead of their time. We think, for example, of anti-slavery activists in the 19th century, or perhaps civil rights activists in the 20th century. We think of these people as moral reformers or pioneers because they recognized that there were problems with our prevailing moral views, but they can only be moral pioneers or reformers if it's possible to make moral progress, to take our moral system and make it better, make it truer. So the very idea that there are moral reformers shows that moral relativism must be false. Ultimately, it is not important for Lewis that we have a perfect understanding of morality. our understanding of what is required of us by morality may very well be mistaken, even deeply mistaken in some ways. What is important is that we have enough of an understanding of the moral law to recognize that we are being held responsible or accountable in some way, and also to realize that sometimes we fail. We fail to live up to the standard. And even if we misunderstand some of what God wants from us, we may still be aware that there is a mind that is holding us accountable and that we have in some ways failed to measure up to the standard. He concludes the first chapter of Mere Christianity in the following way. He says, there are 2 points I want to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and they cannot really get rid of that idea. Secondly, they do not in fact always behave in that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. But we don't need to have a perfect grasp of the law of nature or the law of morality in order to know these facts. A child, think of the following example. Suppose we have a child who misunderstands what a parent is telling the child to do. Such a child may still recognize that they are accountable to the parent. Furthermore, the parent may recognize that the child is being disobedient, even if the parent's commands are not correctly understood. The child may displease the parent if the child intends to disobey, even if the child accidentally does what the parent was telling the child to do. In the same way, a human person might do evil by intending to violate the moral law, even if the person's grasp of the moral law is faulty. Such a person may rightly understand himself or herself as both accountable and guilty. So that's most of what I want to say about the first premise and how Lewis defends the first premise of his argument. Now I want to turn to the second premise. And in looking at the second premise, I'm also going to look at the second version of the argument, because I think that version mainly is a way of defending the second premise. And perhaps we might think the person who wants to reject Lewis's conclusion would do better to challenge the second premise of the argument, which is, if you look back on the handout, if there is an objective moral law for humans, there is a God. Couldn't someone agree with Lewis that there is an objective morality, but deny that we need God to account for morality? Here, the relevant premise of the second version of the argument is crucial. Here's from the second version. The best explanation for the existence of an objective moral law for humans is that a God exists who is the source of the moral law. In other words, the person who wants to defend this has a sort of twofold task, which is something I take on in my discussion of the moral argument in Natural Science and Knowledge of God. First of all, you've got to explain how is it that God accounts for morality? How is it that God does provide an explanation for morality? Then you've got to look at rival explanations, secular, naturalistic explanations, and try to show that they don't work, that they fail, that they aren't as successful as the theistic explanation. And that's roughly what I think Lewis does. If we could explain morality in some naturalistic way, or at least in a way that's consistent with atheism, then perhaps a person could accept morality but deny that morality requires God. So this is the objection I'm going to deal with now. There are various ways, of course, someone might try to explain morality as a purely natural phenomenon. And once more, since he's talking to a general audience, Lewis doesn't consider, you might say, developed, sophisticated philosophical versions of these objections. And he couldn't have been considering theories that have only recently appeared on the philosophical scene. However, I do think once more that Lewis does intuitively, you might say, grasp the main types of views that are possible when one is trying to explain morality in a naturalistic way. And I think what Lewis has to say about these views, again, seems to be on the right track. Defenders of the moral argument in the philosophical arena will, I think, wind up pursuing the kinds of strategy Lewis uses, at least if they're wise. Now, the first naturalistic option might be this. Maybe we can explain morality because we'll say that morality is simply something rooted in biology. Maybe we can give a scientific explanation of morality. Lewis considers such a view, at least in embryo, by replying to some people who wrote to him saying, "Isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like all the other instincts?" In other words, isn't morality just a kind of instinct that we can explain as a result of evolution, like all other instincts? In effect, the person who says this is saying that morality or altruistic behavior is something that's perfectly natural. It doesn't need any kind of special explanation. We can explain it all scientifically. Now, in responding to this objection to his argument, Lewis does not deny that we have instincts, and he certainly doesn't deny that the existence of our instincts can be given a biological explanation. Instead, what he argues is that our moral obligations are not reducible to, not understandable as instincts. It is one thing to have a strong desire to help another person, quite a different thing to believe that you ought to help the other person, whether you have that desire or not. Morality, in other words, involves an element of judgment, a judgment that we make about our instincts. Sometimes our instinctual desires are on the side of morality. Sometimes we do have altruistic impulses, sympathy, you might say, but sometimes they are not. And when we have a conflict of instinctual desires, often it's true, morality sides with the weaker desire. That is, morality often sides with what we really don't want to do very much. Morality tells us we ought to try to save another person from drowning, even though we might instinctively be very afraid and fearful. We might very much prefer to stay on the bank in safety. Morality, Lewis says, cannot be identified with an instinct, because with respect to all of our instincts, there are times when morality will say that instinct needs to be curbed. And other times, morality will say that instinct needs to be strengthened. It needs to be beefed up. Now, of course, as I've said, the philosophical scene today features versions of ethical naturalism that are far more sophisticated than what Lewis is talking about. However, I think Lewis has claimed that morality cannot be equated with any sort of natural drive or desire or instinct. Anything that evolution, you might say, has programmed into us, that seems perfectly right. In the end, morality is about how we ought to behave. It's not simply giving explanations of how we in fact behave. Moral obligations, then, cannot be reduced to natural facts about how we do behave, what they enjoy or what they approve of or anything like that. A second strategy for someone who doesn't want to think that God is necessary for morality might be to see morality not as grounded in biology, science, or nature, but to see morality as a human invention, a kind of cultural construction rather than something derived from our genes. Lewis also briefly considers this kind of view. He says, someone writes him a letter and says, "Isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education?" The person who proposed this idea to Lewis was probably really objecting to the first premise in my reconstructed version of the argument. At least that is what Lewis takes the objection to mean in the book. He responds that this person seems to think that because we have learned about morality from parents and teachers and the broader culture, that shows morality was just something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked. Such a view is really just another version of the claim that the moral law is not objective. Lewis responds to the objection by agreeing that morality is something we've learned from our parents and teachers and people like that. He says that's perfectly true. But he rejects the idea that this means morality is something purely cultural and artificial. He says morality is more like the truths of mathematics. We learn about mathematics from our teachers and our parents as well, but mathematical truths are real truths. And in the same way, he thinks that moral truths are real truths, and the evidence for that is the falsity of cultural relativism. There are, of course, some philosophers today who want to say that morality, while a human invention, is not relativistic. They want to hold to the idea that there is objective morality. They just want to say we don't need God to explain that morality. It's a view that's sometimes called constructivism. Morality is something we've constructed, but there's a kind of objectivity about the construction. We could only do it in one way, so there's going to be some sort of objective truth and falsity. And Lewis doesn't really consider constructivism. It didn't exist in his day. But I think the germ of a reply is already present in his answer to the person who says morality is a cultural invention. Lewis assumes in his reply that if morality were just a human invention, it would not possess the authority and objectivity that genuine morality does have. I think he's right about that. Contemporary constructivists, I think, have not succeeded in showing that morality is genuinely objective and that it has genuine objective authority. Whether we see morality as an individual construction, as in some we might call contemporary Kantians, like philosopher Christine Korsgaard at Harvard, or whether we think of the construction as a kind of social group project, as in a contemporary thinker like Ronald Milo, I think in both cases we'll see that in the end these views of morality fail because they don't account for the objectivity. In the end, Korsgaard says, for example, that how do we construct morality? It's based on our identity, our sense of who we are, because she says in the end, a belief about what you ought to do is a belief about your identity. But people have all kinds of identities, and it seems very difficult to rescue objectivity. And in fact, in the end, Korsgaard admits that it's not necessarily the case that you ought always to do what morality tells you. Moral obligations, she says, are not the only kind of value, and we may value other things more than morality. So in the end, morality, I think, lacks the kind of authority that it should have. And I think similar problems face the social contract sort of views. Now, another way of trying to explain morality without God is to simply see it as a way of behaving that is adopted for self-interested reasons. Now, once more, you could think of this as just a way of rejecting the first premise of the argument. A person who says this might be denying the objectivity of morality, seeing morality as simply an expression of my subjective emotions. When other people act decently towards me, I like this. I find it convenient and useful, so I approve of what they do. On this reading of the objection, it would be the objectivity of morality that's being denied. And Lewis responds to this by pointing out that sometimes people do immoral things that we find useful. Such as a person who betrays his own country to help our own country in a war situation. In that case, we may like what the person is doing because it's very useful to us, but we still don't admire the person. We regard him as a traitor to his own country. And we don't necessarily approve of the moral quality of his actions, even though we're glad he's doing what he's doing. But a second way of understanding the idea that morality is rooted in self-interest would be this. We might think that we adopt moral behavior because it pays. Morality is based on a kind of social contract or a social agreement. On this view, morality exists and it's objective. But we can explain it in the same way we explain any self-interested behavior. I just sort of say to you, I'll treat you in a certain way if you agree to treat me in a certain way, and we'll both be better off. And we have this sort of agreement, and morality is just the rules of our agreement. That's all we have to say about morality. Lewis thinks that this view simply won't work, and the reason it doesn't work is that morality is not, in fact, always in our self-interest. It doesn't always pay. Here's a quote. He says, "As for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it's pretty obvious that it doesn't mean behavior that pays. Morality," he says, "requires us often to do things we really don't want to do." And here's a longer quote. "It means being content with 30 shillings when you might have gotten 3 pounds, doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her, staying in dangerous places when you could go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look like a fool." Once more, Lewis's argument is not developed, but I think he's exactly right to claim that morality cannot be reduced to self-interest, at least when self-interest is understood in a naturalistic way. It's simply, you might say, The person who wants to explain morality as a kind of social bargain in this way really has no answer to the person the economists call the free rider, the parasite, the person who's happy to say, yeah, I go along with this agreement, but violates the agreement selectively when they can do so and get away with it and not be detected. That's obviously going against morality, but it's really hard to see if morality is just self-interest. What's wrong with being a free rider or a parasite? Another way of interpreting this view that morality is based on a sort of social contract might be saying this: well, look, isn't morality simply a matter of seeking the well-being of others? Lewis says, well, it's true. Morality is a matter of seeking the well-being of others and also of ourselves, but that's not an explanation of morality. That's a restatement of what needs to be explained. In effect, this person is saying morality requires us to be unselfish. That's correct. But by itself gives no explanation of why we should be unselfish. Some confusion may arise at this point, though, because people do recognize that generally a society in where there are many people who live morally, who play fair and live decently, that's going to be a better society than a society where people are flagrant liars and cheaters and thieves. And so society in general would be better off if people live by the rules of morality. So you might say, well, we'll all be better off. Everyone will be better off if we all live by morality. Therefore, I'll be better off if we live by morality. Sorry about that. I'll try not to beat my chest here too many times since there's a microphone there. The ambiguity lies in the term everyone. If we mean, when we say, well, everyone will be better off if we all live morality, if we mean that in general, that on average, society would be better off and people would be better off, that seems right. However, the fact that people in general will be better off in a morally good society does not mean that every individual will be better off, certainly not better off on every occasion. In fact, it seems clear that a free rider or parasite who is skillful will be better off than he or she would be if the free rider lived by the rules. And if you doubt that, just read Machiavelli, who gives you advice on how to be a free rider, a parasite, how to appear to be morally good while actually doing exactly what you want to get what you want. In any case, the best this sort of social contract view of morality could possibly do would be to give us a morality that would be conditional or hypothetical. The social agreement would be something like this: I agree to behave a certain way towards you if you agree to behave that way towards me. I will treat you this way if you will treat me this way. In other words, I don't have an unconditional obligation to treat other people morally, just an obligation to treat other people morally so long as they are treating me that way. The idea is, be good to your friends, but your enemies, you can do whatever you want to them. If they treat you badly, you can treat them badly. In the actual world, of course, we know people are not always going to behave morally. We know, for example, that many college students cheat. I hope that's not true at Baylor, but it's true in the United States. Many students cheat in school. So if you go on the basis, I won't cheat as long as nobody else cheats, you don't have very much of a reason not for cheating. The really moral person is the person who says, I'm not going to cheat. I don't care what the others do. It's wrong. I'm not going to do it. The same thing is true about, let's say, being honest, paying our income taxes. If you say, I'll be honest when I fill out my income taxes if everybody else is honest, you have no obligation to fill out your income taxes honestly, because you know not everyone else is going to be honest. So real honesty is when you say, I'm going to be honest, I don't care what others do. So I think it's obvious that this sort of social bargain view doesn't really give us morality. It at best gives us an imitation morality, a morality that would only hold in certain circumstances. The result is, I think, all of the secular explanations of morality that are on offer fail, or they don't work very well. How does the theistic view work? Well, it's obvious. If God is the moral lawgiver, and if the voice of conscience that we hear is really God speaking to us, then we have an explanation. And we also have reasons to be moral, because if being moral is in part bound up with our God relation, and if God is the greatest good, knowing God is the greatest good, then we all have good reasons to be moral, to care about morality. Lewis thinks the lesson, here's my conclusion, the lesson to be learned from morality is that there is, quote, something like a mind that seems to make a demand on us, a demand that we recognize as having genuine authority. Now, we don't know much else at this point. He says this something may or may not be the Christian God. If you were only going on reason and on the moral argument, you wouldn't really know that the God that you believe in is the God of the New Testament. But the fact that we are aware of the reality of this something should at least make us reject the naturalistic view that this finite world is the only reality there is. When we recognize that there is something like a moral mind that is making a claim on us, as well as the fact that we have failed to satisfy this claim, we are then, you might say, prepared to encounter the Christian gospel, which comes to us not through natural revelation, but through a special revelation in history. Natural reason alone, Lewis says, cannot carry us all the way to the Christian God, but it can prepare us for an encounter with the revelation the Christian God has given us. If we recognize there is something or someone beyond the natural world, we should be more open to the possibility of a revelation from that reality. And so in the next parts of Mere Christianity, Lewis goes on to discuss the shocking, surprising fact that God became a human being. Well, thank you for your attention.
Dr. Evans has been kind enough to not only prepare an excellent talk for us to reflect on this afternoon, but also to answer some questions. And so we have a few minutes before our reception for some cute questions and answers. I'll try to keep it cute here, and I would love for a student to have first shot at the first question.
Yes. Make sure a student, so I don't have to answer Trent Dougherty's first question.
Yes, please. Do you mind standing up and speaking loudly?
Okay, my question is, C.S. Lewis sees morality as proof of God or something that just points to God?
I think Lewis never uses the word proof. And I think myself he would say something like this. Morality provides us with good evidence, good reasons, sufficient evidence or sufficient reasons to believe in God. But I don't think Lewis would have been disturbed by the fact that it's not a proof. Because I think he would think this, that genuine religious faith must have also within it an element of what we might call voluntariness. If I give you a kind of proof that forces or coerces your intellect, then you might be sort of dragged into a belief that you might not really want to have. So I think Lewis thinks it may be appropriate that although there's evidence here, and he thinks the evidence is good evidence, it's powerful, that if you're really determined to resist belief in God, you'll find some way of explaining the evidence away. You can be aware of that natural sign, but some way of explaining it will occur to you, and perhaps some of the views that I've talked about would be one of those views. So I don't think Lewis would have been bothered by the idea that this is not a proof. He doesn't think proof is the right standard, you might say, or the right goal. That's my guess. I don't know of any place where he discusses that explicitly, but that seems to me to be what his practice implies. Good question.
Yes, please. Stand and speak loudly.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mike Newman. I teach at Charleston State. It seemed to me when you got to to defending the second premise that a couple of different versions of it were being inflated. So when you say the second premise reads, if there's an objective moral law for humans, there is a God. And then 1, 2, 3 that are listed there are, they don't really even purport to serve as counterexamples to that conditional in premise 2, because like when you ask the question, do we need God to explain morality? You can, that the question as it stands can be taken as somewhat equivocal, because on the one hand, you could take seriously the felt obligation, like you're trying to explain why you should take that seriously if you do take it seriously, or you could try to be trying to explain why is there the experience of normative obligation without actually taking it seriously. So it seems like 1 through 3, they actually are supposed to be explaining the phenomenon of moral.
The phenomenology of our moral experience.
Yeah, so they're trying to explain that without taking seriously the idea that we are really, in a deep sense, morally obligated. So I think you have to go back to the kernel goes back to the idea that the felt experience of morality is itself something that doesn't need an argument. But then the question is whether you actually take that seriously.
Well, I mean, I think you're right in a way. On the handout there, I give the sort of 3 types of alternative secular explanations of morality. But each of those, I think, is ambiguous. When I give a scientific explanation of morality, what am I doing? Well, one thing I might be doing is saying, I don't really think there is such a thing as objective morality, but scientifically we can explain why people believe there is. We can explain the beliefs and instincts that evolution has given rise to. And what we've really done then is not explain morality, but we've explained morality away. Right? And you're right, that would be an attack on the first premise and not on the second. However, there are secular thinkers who want to take naturalism in a more morally objective way. There's a group of philosophers, for example, called the Cornell Realists, who are all secular atheistic thinkers, and they think that moral propositions are reducible to propositions about natural facts. So on their view, there really are objective moral truths. We just don't need God to explain them. We need science to explain them. So that would be the second way of interpreting. And both of those, all of those 3 can be, they have that ambiguity. And that I actually tried to hint at that because Lewis tends to interpret them as attacking the first premise in each case. But I tried to show how you could view this as an attack on the second premise if you disambiguate the 2 versions of the view. For example, on the biological thing, there's a book about 15 years ago by Larry Arnhart called Darwinian Natural Right. And in the book, Arnhart tries to argue that we can give a perfectly natural explanation of morality. We just have to study human beings as biological creatures, find what desires are, quote, natural, and then those will be the ones that are good. And then we base a moral theory on that. Of course, the problem is exactly what Lewis says. Just because behavior is, quote, natural doesn't make it good. And you can see that actually if you look at Arnhart's book. One of the things he says is natural to us, especially males, is that we like to dominate and control the people around us. So he's forced by his own theory to say that that desire is morally good. But it often isn't morally good. It's often, of course, a very destructive desire. So I think the problem with Arnhart's view is exactly the same problem that Lewis is pointing out. You can't simply infer from the fact that behavior is instinctive or natural that it's morally right or good. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Other questions or comments?
Steve, thank you very much. Excellent paper, as always. You're clear, your illustrations are persuasive. And so I ask you why, in offering, I think, very convincing responses to both secular and atheist opponents of objective morality. You didn't deal with the great Christian objector to natural or universal moral law, that is Alistair McIntyre. Because McIntyre argues, as you well know, that morality is deeply embedded in tradition. They're handed down from community to community. They are the products, therefore, of languages and cultures, often, as you say, overlapping, but often also contradicting. And of course, he gives pretty obvious examples. I'm doing C.S. Lewis till we have faces in the class right now, and point out that Stoics highly valued suicide, as did the high culture of imperial Japan. The Christians made suicide something forbidden from the start. We know that the Aztecs, high culture, high civilization, practiced child sacrifice. Lewis himself changed his mind about this as he grew older. In Four Loves, he says, the Stoics say, we should never love anything that would break our hearts if we lost them. He says that would thereby outlaw all true love of children and spouses and so forth. But then he says in his book on Reflection on Psalms, what no culture holds as a universal moral norm is the love of and forgiveness of enemies. And of course, he's referring to the Jewish Christian tradition there. So McIntyre's point is that Christians and Jews begin with God's self-revelation and then try to seek what follows from that as far as universal implication goes. And so the motto of this Irish college is Fides Quaerens Intellectum, faith seeking understanding, not understanding seeking faith. So what do you do with McIntyre? It seems to be very powerful objection to the notion of some kind of changeless, timeless, placeless, universal, natural, objective morality.
Well, I don't want to get into our argument about the proper interpretation of McIntyre because I'm not an expert on his work. I've read his works, but I do think myself that the kind of views that McIntyre defends in After Virtue, if I think I'm correct, the first edition of that book he wrote when he had not yet come back to faith, had not yet become a Christian again. And I think since then he's moved in the direction of a stronger, more objective view. But that's not really at the issue.
Could I interrupt just a minute?
Yeah.
Whose justice, which morality, is an even stronger affirmation of the position he took there. This is well after his Christian conversion.
Well, I think in some of McIntyre's writings there's a greater. I think he's well. I'm not going to say anything more about McIntyre because it's really not important. What's important is you say morality is cultural. There's vast differences, big differences between one culture and another. We learn about morality through culture, through language, something social. Lewis agrees with every bit of that. He says all of that in the first part of Mere Christianity. He doesn't deny that at all. His point is simply, look, it could very well be, suppose I had 100 beliefs about morality. Suppose 90 of them were deeply mistaken. 90% you might, if we were going to use contemporary with language, we would say, my moral beliefs, 90% of it is noise, 10% of it is information. Still, that 10% might be enough to help me understand that I am a morally accountable being and that I have failed to live up to my moral responsibilities. So the fact that there are these moral disagreements doesn't faze Lewis in his argument there at all. And I think he's right to do that. And I don't think it's right to say this. And perhaps you were suggesting that this is McIntyre's view. If so, I think McIntyre's wrong. But some people might want to say, look, our knowledge of morality that we get through culture is so shot through with error, so full of mistakes, that we should just deny that there is anything like general moral knowledge and say that the only real knowledge of morality comes through revelation. Only Yeah, I'm glad you didn't, because it would be a false view. And one of the reasons it's a false view is that Revelation itself denies that that's true. In Romans, Paul says people who are without the law, that is God's special revelation, still have a knowledge of the natural law. And it's enough to make them accountable, responsible, he says. And I think that's true. So I think that, as I say, morality certainly has got plenty of noise and cultural chatter and clutter. Lewis knows that and believes that. Kierkegaard knows that and believes that. But still, it could very well be true that morality is a clue that points us to the fact that we are not autonomous, we are responsible and accountable, and we should pay attention to that natural sign.
Could I ask one more very important question? Because a student of mine, years later, has a niece who was brought up in the pagan Northwest. There she was taught that selfishness is the only virtue. So we have a culture in which people's consciences are not being formed to believe that selfishness is wrong. This student has adopted that niece to try to enculturate her, i.e. also Christianize her, out of those cultural assumptions that she was taught. His argument is she's basically an animal, and therefore it's taking enormous pains to bring her out of the morality, if you want to call it that, which she was inculcated into, and more of our culture is also being inculcated into. Her conscience doesn't carry any kind of force at all.
Well, let me just say, that's a very good point and a true point. And one of the things I noticed when I was thinking about rereading, which I hadn't read Mere Christianity in many years, when I reread the book in preparation for this, it struck me Lewis could take for granted that his audience would respond in a certain way to what he was saying, because there was still a basic sense of decency present. You can see that in let's see, a contemporary of Lewis is like Camus. When Camus writes The Plague, he has this secular character, the doctor, Dr. Rieux, who basically, when people say, "Are you a hero?" he says, "No, I'm just trying to do the decent thing. It's just acting with common human decency." And you're perfectly right. Conscience can be undermined, dulled, corrupted, and upbringing can do that, because we are thoroughly historical creatures. And so we have not only the chatter of culture, but the sort of deformation that occurs when someone, you might say, isn't brought up properly. Even Aristotle says you can't expect to do moral philosophy if you weren't brought up properly. You won't have the right, understanding of these things. So also, if someone you might say has the attitude of a psychopath, or is a complete narcissist, and so, you can't start by giving that person a moral argument, because they won't be able to see the truth of the premises. That person needs to be re-socialized. That person needs to relearn what it is to be a human being. Kierkegaard would say, you need to help that person develop the right kind of subjectivity in order for them to see the truth. So I think it's not at all implied by this argument that Lewis thinks, or that I think, that this argument will be successful in every case, or that anyone will be able to see it and see the truth of the premises. It might very well be that if you have been corrupted in the wrong way, either intellectually by studying the wrong theories, or morally by being taught to live in the wrong way, that you'll just won't be able to see it. But that's not a problem with the argument, that's a problem with the person. But in that case, what the person needs is not argument. The person needs friendship, love, teaching.
Other questions? I want to go back to section 4, number 1, 2, and 3. And while people are turning there, I just want to note, going back to your answer to Micah, that our guest here Friday night, will be my conversation partner, atheist Eric Wielenberg, is an individual who does believe in objective morality. He just doesn't think that we need it for God. So he's a pretty good example of the sort of thing that you were talking about. So the question I have is this. 1, 2, and 3 are objections to objective morality, and the defenses then would be defenses of objective morality. But what do you have to say to someone who says, okay, I believe in objective morality, but that might be constituted by objective moral values. They don't see the need to posit objective moral duties. That would be, because technically, morality doesn't specify between values and duties. And I wonder if you can answer both in terms of Lewis's argument and as well as your own argument.
Yeah. Well, I didn't discuss this sort of view because I wanted to keep this talk within manageable limits. But in addition to these three ways, and I take 1, 2, and 3, as I said, all as ambiguous. That is, you could take them as objections to premise 1, but you could also take them as articulations of somebody who says, I believe in objective morality, but here's how I'm going to explain it, either scientifically or constructivism or just a self-interested behavior or something like that. I think myself, the strongest view that an atheist can have here, the best response to the sort of moral argument, is to simply say, moral truths are just true. There's no explanation for them. They're just true. They're ultimate truths. They're not reducible to anything or explainable. They're just truths about the world. In effect, I take it, someone who says this, the technical name for this would be, this person is an ethical non-naturalist who thinks that moral propositions are sort of basic. I think this is really, in the end, a kind of Platonism. And it seems to me that that's a very difficult, the reason why I think that's the strongest view an atheist can have is it's very difficult to know how to respond to it because the person is sort of saying, I'm not going to give you any explanation for morality. I don't have to because it's basic. But since the person hasn't given me any explanation of morality, there's nothing for me to refute. I can't attack his account of morality. He gives no account of morality. He claims morality is just something basic and ultimate. My best response to that is to say, that sounds a lot like Plato. And at the very least, Platonism, and there are non-theistic Platonists, to be sure, people like Iris Murdoch. So you could be a non-believer in God and you can be a Platonist. But the overwhelming majority of non-theists in our world are not Platonists. And many of them are just as suspicious of Platonism as they are of theism. I remember when I was in graduate school, one of my professors was defending a logical view. And another professor who was auditing the course raised his hand and he said, Professor Louis, don't you realize what you just said? That's Platonism. And the speaker, Professor Louis, turns around and says, oh, my dear Jaeger, I know it's Platonism. No one wants to be a Platonist. It's like believing in God. No one wants to believe in God today. But what do you do if the logical facts force you there? So that was his response. And that's what I would want to say. I would say, look, when you think about it, isn't a Platonic worldview really kind of close to a Christian worldview? We're both admitting that reality is not purely natural or physical, that it can have some sort of value-laden character, that morality is somehow a deep structure of the universe, not a superficial surface phenomena of the universe. In other words, I think I would say, okay, if you think Platonism is true, and that's your explanation of morality, fine. But you know what? I think Platonism is a view that fits very well with my theistic view. Let me discuss that with you. So that's the kind of response I would make to that sort of view. And I think Wielenberg is in fact a Platonist in the guy who's coming this weekend.
Yeah, I want to make sure if there are students with questions that they get in as we're drawing to a close. So if you students have a thought, please show me your hand. I see Akshay. So,
the explanations given as, well, essentially as refuting premise 2, these are all materialistic explanations of morality. However, C.S. Lewis describes God as some sort of mind-like phenomenon giving objective views of morality. How are these materialistic views refuting the intentionality of God? Or the way it seems to me
Well, yeah, strictly speaking, I mean, in terms of what we might call the dialectic going on here, if I give a moral argument for God and say, we need God because without God we can't really explain morality, and my interlocutor says, oh no, we don't need God, here's another way to explain morality that doesn't require God. Of course, he hasn't shown that atheism is true. He's not arguing that theism is necessarily false. What he has done is he has undermined a positive reason I've been giving to believe in God, right? So you're quite right. That doesn't establish the truth of naturalism, but still it's worrying if he could make out his case because he's undermined one of the reasons that I think we have to believe in theism. Does that make sense?
So a naturalistic, or let's say neurological explanation of morality would undermine a theistic explanation.
Well, if it could explain the normativity. You see, the crucial thing that Lewis hammers on again and again is that morality consists of truths about what we ought to do, not just facts about what we do. Now, any facts about what we do are quite subject to scientific explanation. But here, he can actually appeal to a lot of secular philosophers who agree with him that we cannot simply jump from fact statements to value statements. We can't just jump from an is to an ought. David Hume says that. C.S. Lewis follows Hume on that point, and I think they're right. But you're quite right. Merely refuting the moral argument would not show that God doesn't exist. It at best would show that one of the reasons given for belief in God is not a good reason.
Well, I'd ask for student questions, and we're almost to a student. There's a graduate student question in that counts as a special.
Okay, so what we're looking for is a way of explaining the normativity of moral claims, and in your argument for the objectivity of that, you said that Lewis sort of points to the mind. There seems to be some sort of mind behind compelling us to do something or to avoid doing something. But I wonder if there are other minds we could appeal to besides the divine mind that could also sort of either implicitly or explicitly place a duty on us. It seems like we're surrounded by other minds. Human minds are the kind of things that maybe could impart some kind of duty as well. So we get the normativity of moral truths just from the minds around us and what they impose on us.
Sure, that's a possible strategy. And in fact, I think I really intended, maybe I didn't do so very clearly, but I intended to talk about that option. And I think the problem is grounding morality in other human minds. I presume you mean human minds, not supernatural angels or demons or anything like that. It just doesn't get us, you might say, the right kind of authority and objectivity. Because just suppose for the moment something like moral expressivism is true. So when I say it's wrong to steal, what I'm really saying is I don't approve of your stealing. I'm expressing how I feel about your stealing. And you say, I don't care what you feel about my stealing. I don't value your opinion of me or your emotions or attitudes towards me. But notice the same thing could be true if instead of expressing my individual attitude, suppose we saw our moral obligation as somehow expressing some sort of general social norm, grounded not in one individual, but in society or something like that. Well, that's Hegel's view of morality. Hegel says morality in the end is a social morality grounded in the customs and laws of a rational society, a people who is living at the end of history, like our society. And that, in effect, deifies society. But I think that in the end, I want to say that even if I lived in a pretty good moral society, where public opinion, social opinion was pretty good, it still might be reasonable in some cases to imagine someone who is a Socrates or, a Martin Luther King Jr., who says, look, most people in my society may think this way and think this is right, but I think they're wrong. I'm going to critique my society. And if we think it's possible for there to be genuine moral reformers who are ahead of their time, so to speak, who saw that the moral expectations of other people in their society were mistaken or wrong, then I think we can't accept that kind of view. It just doesn't give us the authority and objectivity, because I might very well say, just as I might say to an individual, I don't care if most people in my society don't approve of what I'm doing, I still think it's right.
Sure.
So the way I was thinking, or I was thinking that the objectivity would come from the objectivity of what's good for humans, and the authority would come from them being humans, which is a valuable thing, or they're the sorts of things to like pursue the good of, and then their good is what's objective.
Right. Well, I think what I would want to say about that is, first of all, there's a lot to be said about the objectivity of value as well. And why is it that we humans have some sort of objective value? Now, we might take a Platonist line here, as I was saying in responding to Dr. Dougherty. But if we don't take a Platonist line, I think we need some sort of explanation of the value. And that may be give us room for some sort of argument there too. But even if we have the value in the sense of the good, I don't think that gets us duties. It doesn't get us obligations. In my view, obligations are always social in nature. They require some sort of social relationship or institution. And mere goodness by itself doesn't get us there. An example I often give goes like this. If I'm driving in Germany on the Autobahn, it's good for me to drive, let's say, less than 100 miles an hour, because I'm not that good a driver. But I don't have an obligation to drive less than 100 miles an hour because there are no speed limits on the Autobahn. Now, if the German legislature passes a law, then I would have a legal obligation. I think morality is very similar to legality. It's different. But like all forms of obligation, I think it ultimately has its roots in some sort of social relationship or institution. The good is a part of the story. Presumably when human legislators pass laws, they try to aim at the good. But when they pass a law, an act that might have been good already, like not driving more than 100 miles an hour on the Autobahn, now becomes something more than good. It becomes a duty. And the duty needs some extra explanation. The mere goodness alone doesn't explain the whole thing.
Well, folks, I don't want to impose too long on our guest time, and I would like there to be sufficient time to enjoy the comestibles in the back that have been provided for reception and for folks to have a chance to thank our speaker in person. So let me try to draw our conversation to a close with a quick reminder that the students have some information in the back about a way to make doing this in the summer. So let me ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Evans for a delightful presentation.